IVM.
भाई हम हिंदुस्तानियों को बतियाना बड़ा पसंद है। बंगाली में अड्डा, उड़िया में खोट्टी, कन्नड़ा में हरटे और हिंदी में पुलियाबाजी। इस कला के लिए हमारी हर भाषा में एक शब्द है।
हम तीनों तो अक्सर मिलकर पुलियाबाजी करते ही रहते हैं, तो हमने सोचा आपको भी इसमें शामिल कर लिया जाए।
तो आइए प्रणय, सौरभ और ख्याति के साथ करते हैं पुलियाबाजी।
हेलो सौरभ, कैसे हैं आप?
एकदम बढ़िया प्रणय, तुम बताओ ख्याति।
बस मैं ठीक हूँ। तो आज हम अपनी आजादी की राह सीरीज में और एक एपिसोड लेकर आ रहे हैं। तो क्या है विषय आज का?
इस श्रृंखला में की एक और कड़ी के ऊपर बात करते हैं। वैसे मैंने लास्ट एपिसोड में तो छुट्टी मार दी थी, लेकिन इस बार मैं वापस आ गया हूँ। और इस बार जैसा आप कह रहे थे ख्याति की, आजादी की राह में हम लोगों ने कई एपिसोड किए हैं। अभी एक साइंस के ऊपर किया है, एक पिछली बार आप लोगों ने ट्रेड के ऊपर किया, लेकिन अभी तक हम लोगों ने जो रियासतें थी, प्रिंसली स्टेट्स, उसके ऊपर कोई भी एपिसोड नहीं किया है। और वो जानना बहुत जरूरी है, क्योंकि भारत का बहुत बड़ा हिस्सा था वो आजादी के पहले। और वहां पे क्या हो रही थी, आजादी के बारे में चर्चा या फिर वहां का माहौल क्या था, वो जानना बहुत जरूरी है। ऐसा नहीं लगता आपको?
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल, कुछ मेरे ख्याल से 40% के करीब का भारत मेरे ख्याल से रजवाड़ों के पास, और वो भी कुछ 575 रजवाड़े। तो इसके लिए बड़ी संख्या, बड़ा वो। और मैंने देखा है कि काफी फर्क भी होता है। जो लोग पुराना ब्रिटिश इंडिया के टाइम का अपना विवरण देते हैं वर्सेस जो महाराजा के टाइम का देते हैं, वो काफी अलग होता है। और महाराजा इतने तरीके के हैं, तो अलग अलग महाराजाओं के अंडर में लोगों के अलग एक्सपीरियंस थे। कोई अंग्रेजों से ज्यादा क्लोज थे, कोई नहीं थे, कोई महाराजा अच्छे थे, कोई नहीं थे। तो हम आज बेसिकली किस महाराजा को चुन रहे हैं?
हाँ, तो ऐसा है कि 21 तोपों की जो सलामी दी जाती थी ब्रिटिश राज में, उसमें पांच पांच थे शायद, है ना? बड़ौदा, ग्वालियर, जम्मू एंड कश्मीर, हैदराबाद और मैसूर। तो और हम लोग तो बैंगलोर में हैं, तो हम लोग सोच रहे थे कि मैसूर के ऊपर एक एपिसोड करते हैं और जानने की कोशिश करते हैं कि वहाँ का परिप्रेक्ष्य क्या था, वहाँ का संदर्भ क्या था, तकरीबन 1800 से लेके 1947 तक। तो इस विषय पर और इस एक्साइटिंग टॉपिक पर चर्चा करने के साथ हमारे जुड़ रहे हैं सिद्धार्थ राजा। सिद्धार्थ वैसे तो पेशे से लॉयर हैं, लेकिन उनकी जान और उनका इंटरेस्ट है हिस्ट्री में, इतिहास में। तो और एक हेरिटेज वॉक कंपनी भी चलाते हैं, जो नंदी हिल्स और हम्पी, उसके बारे में वो काफी ज्ञान रखते हैं और काफी चीजें सुनी है हमने उनसे मैसूर स्टेट के बारे में। तो हम लोगों ने सोचा कि उन्हें आमंत्रित करते हैं और उन्हीं से सुनते हैं कि मैसूर में क्या हो रहा था इस टाइम के दौरान। तो स्वागत है आपका सिद्धार्थ।
थैंक यू, नमस्कार, गुड टू बी हियर।
यस। तो सिद्धार्थ, एकदम शुरुआत से शुरू करते हैं। पहले तो अब जैसे हम लोगों ने कई बार सुना है एंग्लो मैसूर वॉर्स के बारे में, और एक फोर्थ एंग्लो मैसूर वॉर था 1799 में, जिसके बाद ब्रिटिशर्स का जो वर्चस्व था वो कायम हो गया इस एरिया में। तो उस दौरान 1799 के आसपास क्या माहौल था, क्या पॉलिटिकल सिचुएशन थी, उसका थोड़ा सा एक विवरण देंगे तो हम लोग फिर वहां से आगे बढ़ेंगे।
थैंक यू। शुरू करने से पहले आई हैव टू गिव वन कैविएट कि मेरा जो हिंदी है उतना अच्छा नहीं है, सो आई विल पेपर इट विथ हिंदी जब व्हेनेवर आई कैन। 1799 is a very interesting and important year in global politics, right? Just before the turn of the 18th to the 19th century. This is the year where in Paris you have Napoleon Bonaparte becoming the first consul, right? Or ये French Revolution के it was a lot of disruption that was replaced by strong power. और the effect यहाँ पे इंडिया में डायरेक्ट था, क्योंकि immediately Britain or France, East India Company and the French authorities were fighting for control of southern India, right? ये जो southern peninsula India में है, यही है the focus of the history. And the British realized that they now have to get rid of their most feared adversary, the one man who stood between them and complete dominance of India, and that was of course Tipu Sultan, right? And Tipu, remember, on the principle ki mera enemy's enemy is my friend, had a tie-up with the French, right? And the French, of course, were very keen to continue to bash the British. But 1799 mein, the French were unable to help materially the Tipu army. So he was all alone. And ek aur baat tha, you must remember that the East India Company, the British East India Company, was allied with both the Nizam and the Marathas. So you have two Indian powers with the British, the East India Company, stacked up against Tipu. And truly, he's the last bulwark, Akhri, the man truly standing between complete dominance. And ye jo fourth Anglo-Mysore war, Pranay, jo you mentioned, was a brief and a brutal war, right? A few weeks, and Srirangapatna mein, that last battle was a really fiery battle. And as many accounts say, it was so fierce and so, heavily fought over that ultimately what got Tipu was betrayal. A lot of his own people betrayed him. I won't go into that. That's another history. In fact, I will leave the point by saying, imagine what the history of India would have been like, the famous what if question, if instead of dying on the battlefield, he had killed Cornwallis, Tipu. They have been very different, the history of southern India and India. Let us not forget, us time pe India ka jo idea tha, nahi tha, right? It was their own individual states. And Tipu has this mixed history, good, bad, ugly, everything. So after the war, jo 1799 ka war mein, it's a total victory, British ka. So they replaced the Wodeyar Maharaja back onto the throne. But remember, he's a titular leader. He's a king in name, but everything else is controlled by the British. And the Wodeyar ka jo ruler tha, us time pe 1799, was a 5-year-old boy, okay, who went on to become Mumbadi Krishnaraj Wodeyar, Krishnaraj Wodeyar the third. He had a long reign. He lived all the way up to 1868. So 69 years ka. I think he was only 5-year-old. So first 10 years, 10-12 years जो था up to 1811, आपने सुना होगा ये दीवान पुरनैया, टिप्पू का famous दीवान पुरनैया. It is told that the Purnaya was Hyder Ali's very close confidant, and Hyder Ali trusted him completely. The story goes that when Hyder was trying to establish some accounts somewhere in Coimbatore or someplace, he was very angry because the accounts were not properly kept. And jo Munshi tha wahan pe, his assistant was Purnaya, who was then a small boy. And Purnaya is supposed to have read from a paper and read the entire accounts. And the legend goes ki wo paper mein kuch nahi tha. Nothing was written. He was only saying from memory. So Tipu had Hyder had a deep respect for him, right? And that continued. Right? Tipu had a bit of a clash. Ye jo hai na, baap ka jo senior minister doesn't fit well with the son. We have heard that plenty of times everywhere across the globe. So, but Purnaya was made the Diwan of Mysore in 1799. Specifically, well, there are allegations that, and well, of course, again, unaccounted for, unverified, that he had helped the British. Pata nahi. It's not. Fact is that he and the Wodeyar king were put back together. And Purnaya was in charge of the administration, क्योंकि जो Mumbadi Krishnaraj Wodeyar था, he was just 5-6 years young boy.
So Purnaya was Tipu ke diwan the when he lost?
नहीं, I'm not sure about that, but very senior officer. ये जो है ना,
कोर्ट का मेंबर थे.
हाँ, Hyder died in 1782, right?
अच्छा.
And Tipu kind of sidelined Purnaya for various reasons. Tipu was he was an arrogant, very self-determined, self-willed, very strong-willed person. Unke baap ki tarah nahi the. In fact, that is the biggest contrast between the two, right? His father was a much more, cooler man.
लेके चलने वाला type बंदा था.
And he was a much more composed. I think he understood the Indian sensibilities more. He knew that he had to deal with caste. Tipu jo tha na, it was like a battering ram, right? Whether against his own people or against the British, right? And of course, the famous dungeons of Srirangapatna, are well known. So Purnaya is put back onto the throne, as made Diwan, and this young boy is king. But by 1811, ये जो दरबार का politics जो है ना, has already started arising, because a 5-6-year-old boy, there are different interests, different landed interests, different political interests. Purnaya gets pushed out in 1811.
सिद्धार्थ, आप वहां पर जाने से पहले, उसके पहले एक और इम्पोर्टेंट डेट है जिसके बारे में मैं चर्चा करना चाहता हूँ, फिर हम लोग उस राजनीति के ऊपर जाएंगे। तो तकरीबन एक वेल्लोर गदर होता है, वेल्लोर म्यूटिनी, जिसके बारे में आपने एक पॉडकास्ट भी किया था, तो उसमें टीपू के जो बेटे थे उनका भी एक रोल है। तो ये तकरीबन 1805-1806 में होता है शायद, मुझे डेट याद नहीं है।
1806 में
1806, राइट? तो उसके बारे में बताइए, उस दौरान क्या हो रहा है, और फिर हम लोग पॉलिटिक्स पर।
Sure. Yeah, interesting. क्योंकि imagine the British are now in control of Mysore. They put the Wodeyar king back onto the throne, but control him. He's a vassal. He's a underling, effectively, but he's put back in prestige on the throne. And you have all of the palace, the darbar coming back together. ये जो सबसे बड़ा वाला threat था, in their mind came from the immediate sons of Tipu Sultan. And usme se the heir to the throne, his name was Fath Haidar, right? Fath Haidar Ali, I think his name is Fath Haidar. Son, the heir to the throne. You know, he is the boy. Well, he's about 20, I think, by that time. He is the one who conducts the last rites. He's the one who identifies, along with his two other brothers, the body of Tipu Sultan. Because Tipu was killed in battle with a bullet wound through his temple, right? Famously, right? Killed by an unknown British soldier. यहाँ पे 3-4 महीने पहले कोई नंजे गौड़ा और उरी गौड़ा, they were saying killed Tipu. That is not true. This is a clearly British army officer or soldier who killed him. So, ये जो son number 2 or 4, remember, son number 2 or 4, their names, I'll give you their full names. Shahzada Abdul Khalik Sultan Sahib, and the fourth in line, Tipu's favorite son, Shahzada Muizuddin Muhammad Sultan Sahib. ये जो दोनों था, at the age of 9, 10 and 8, they had been handed over as hostages in 1792. I don't know if you remember the Cornwallis third Anglo-Mysore war में जब stalemate था, there was no conclusive victory. Treaty of Seringapatam में 1792 में Cornwallis said, ये जो treaty का terms है, how do I ensure कि कौन guarantee देगा that Tipu will adhere to it? क्योंकि they always had a poor view of him. Ki, yaar, he'll go and do something else and he'll start the war again. So they extracted the cruelest guarantee. Shylock, almost like Shylock, cut closest to the heart, closest to the chest, right? By taking away the two sons. Ye dono, the number 2 and number 4, Muizuddin and Abdul Khalik. And they were there with the British for a few years. Keep that in mind. And the British treated them well in Madras, right? In fact, ये दोनों जो थे, I think they had learned sufficient English. They could communicate with their British captors. They were treated well. I think they also had a lot of mannerisms. They were taught how to use a fork and spoon and knife and all of that, right? तो ये दोनों थे जब फतेह हैदर ने identify किया टिप्पू के bodies को, right? And they got a proper Muslim burial done for Tipu. Now, I think the British realized that with all of this जो था, ये दोनों, especially these two, they know us, they have good connections with the French, trouble. So in 1800, shortly after the war, ये सब जो पूरा entourage था, I think almost 200 people or 300 people, remember all the wives and the entire Zanana, सबको, they just transferred them to Vellore. क्योंकि the best thing to do, uproot them from Mysore. Vellore में, it's a new place, we don't know, the locals नहीं थे, local connect नहीं था, and it's easier to keep an eye on them from Madras, right? They moved them to Vellore, right? Except that these two were, I think there is some doubt as to whether they were involved or not, but jo bhi tha, they were definitely like the kind of people rallied to them. The names were good enough. And wo jo mutiny tha, 1806 में, वो short and brief, 1 या 2 दिन में, the British suppressed it with brutal treatment. I mean, Bangalore में भी था, little later 1830s में, यहाँ पे भी एक revolt हुआ था, right, under the British rule. They put people before, they tied them to cannon and blasted them. right? Just to prove that, you deal with me, you deal with extreme, So sometimes you can understand ये जो टिप्पू का treatment जो था ना, it's tit for tat, an eye for an eye, that's the way in which the treatment. So they were responsible. Either they were responsible, I've written about it, as you said, Pranay, or they were certainly very important. And this rattled the British, क्योंकि यहाँ पे भी, they are creating trouble. So let's move them away from here. And they sent them all the way to Calcutta in 1806. Shortly after the Vellore revolt tha, it was an awakening for the British, because they realized ye 50 saal pehle, before the Indian revolt of 1857, local soldiers tha, right? Most of the East India Company ka jo local, the army that was made up of Indian soldiers with, well-paid Telugu, Tamil speaking, Kannada speaking, and all the officers were English or Scotsmen or Irishmen or whoever. But they realized that agar ye yahan pe army ka jo revolt, and if that can add to the confusion in India, then we are done for, right? And so they sent the entire family, including these two sons. Fatehadar continued in Mysore. I think he, ye jo typical princes tha na, they would have been given a lot of, food and drink and the rest. Probably he just wasted himself. I'm not sure. But ye Fatehadar jo tha, he continued, but he wasn't much of a threat. Ye dono, Abdul Khalik or Muizuddin in particular, was dispatched. They were sent off to Calcutta. And Abdul Khalik dies on the way, unfortunately, at the age of 24. And then subsequently, this Muizuddin is incarcerated. वो जेल में था 7 साल के लिए. जेल में था कि मतलब he wasn't even allowed writing instruments. So all of this is telling you that ये Muizuddin was probably a troublemaker. उसको literally solitary confinement में रखा था, right?
To break
Dies
him down.
soon after. They pushed him away, and you go back to Calcutta today, there are a lot of descendants of Tipu over there. In fact, there is a Mysore cemetery at Kalighat Park, right? South Calcutta mein, and around the Toliganj Club, there are a lot of places. Remember, uske baad ek aur refugee aaya tha Calcutta mein 50 years later. वो कौन था? वो भी हमारा अवध का नवाब,
वाजिद अली खान.
वाजिद अली शाह. Fascinating story, right? क्योंकि वो भी, he was possibly a threat. He was a rallying force. Our Bahadur Shah Zafar ko Rangoon भेज दिया, right? This guy was sent to Calcutta to literally under the nose of the Governor General, right? And so unfortunately that revolt, of course, didn't come to much. The British had superior forces, no doubt about it, and the troops of Mysore were demoralized anyway by that time, I think, and there was really no threat. Remember, ये जो Anglo-Mysore war में another important ally is the Nawab of Walajabad, right? Walajabad जो है Madras के just outside Walajapet, right? Is this again the northern districts of current day Tamil Nadu, Ambur, Vaniambadi, all of them are North Arcot districts. They're all Muslim dominated, right? But the Nawab of Walajabad was paid off and pensioned off. Remember, they did the same with both the Nizam. The Nizam was pensioned off much earlier, by the way, even before 1799. Literally, he was paid enough of money. The Marathas have a more testy relationship. Now, ultimately, they finally got rid of the Maratha power in 1818, right? But that's another story, right? But the fact is, this is all connected because they were all allied to the East India Company against Tipu and the rest. So by that, Vellore ka jo mutiny tha, ek sharp, short episode tha, but it was symptomatic of what an Indian uprising could do.
Right.
Yeah? If they got together, we organized ourselves, Indian in the sense, again, let me be very careful over here. There's no India at this point in time, right? It's all individual states, individual territories, right? So we must keep this in mind, that it was the idea of a nation. Tipu was fighting for Mysore, right? Remember that. That for him was the nation state.
Right? वही जैसे कहते हैं, मतलब एक सांस्कृतिक तौर पे एक भारत था तब, लेकिन एक राजनीतिक तौर पे political idea of India didn't exist.
No, didn't exist, and I think it didn't come about until much later, and then that's some amount of debate कि अगर 1857 के बाद हुआ था या फिर Indian National Congress के time पे 1884 line towards the end of the 19th century हुआ था. That's a debate for another place. But coming back to Mysore, by 1811 when Purnaya is ousted, निकाल दिया गया. He was taken away from, and that was Darbar ka politics. Pushed him out. He dies, unfortunately, 1 year later. And where he dies is, by the way, still preserved as a traveler's bungalow. State government का जो है, श्रीरंगपटना में ये मयूरा का जो restaurant है, Riverview restaurant के बगल में ही है. It's the place where Purnaya died. It's called Scott's Bungalow or something like that because some British officer came there afterwards. But यहाँ पे he dies in 1812, right? And जो Mysore administration था ना, that literally collapsed. It became a cesspool of corruption and varying interests. If you look at it, 1812 के बीच वहां से लेकर 1831 तक 19 years में there were 10, 15, 20 divans who came and went, right? They were all, इस faction का दूसरा faction. Remember ये जो the boy is still a boy, right? He only gains majority at in 1813 or 18, something like that, right? He's only 5 years old in 1799. But the Mummadi Krishnaraj Wodeyar, by the way, is very well regarded in old Mysore because he was a patron of the arts. He was a patron of music. He was patron of all kinds of artistic endeavors. In some manner of speaking, he had left the administration to be run by his subordinates, right? And it had been run into the ground after Purnaya's death. And by 1831, the British realized that from one of the most important states in India, remember by 1831, unka domination complete tha, right? 1818 May, they got rid of the Maratha power, right? That famous battle jo hai, wahan pe, I don't remember now what the names were. The Marathas were literally pensioned. Again, they were reduced to a small principality, or at least the power was cut. The British did 3 things, by the way, to control princely states, right? Locally jo tha, you could do what you wanted, right? Apne state. But you had to pay a tribute every year to His Majesty's government, right? At this point in time, still His Majesty, but soon to be Her Majesty with Victoria, right? But you had to pay an annual tribute that was determined by a reference to the percentage of revenue from your land, right? And it was a pretty hefty price. So that was their payment. And payment for what? Like everything the British did was a contractual relationship, right? You paid tribute for 3 things. Communication was controlled by the British because you realize that if you control communication, you control the spread of news, misinformation, right? If you think that fake news ke control abhi aaya hai, the British were already foreseeing that 200 years ago, right? By communication. Then you controlled the external armies. They had a small police force for internal peacekeeping, but no external armies. You had to only do it on the saying of the British. That is second. And foreign relations. Agar Mysore ka Raja ya Sultan wanted relations with the Turkish Ottoman Empire, it had to go through London, right? So these 3 things they controlled, and that's what they did. Punjab mein kiya tha Ranjit Singh or his successor much later, 1840s mein. Marathas ko kiya tha, Nizam ko kiya tha, Baroda, everyone fell into line by the 1830s. And ye jo Mysore ka state mein, 1831 is a significant year because the then British Governor General Lord Bentinck, right, says that, listen, this state is starting to perhaps default on its tribute to the British. Remember, jo bhi kiya, as I always say, the French and the Portuguese and the Spanish, more the Spanish and the Portuguese, conquered their part of the world under the power of the cross, right? The British did it only on the power of the wallet, right? Because of economic reasons. They felt that there was going to be a loss of revenue from Mysore, very important, because of the maladministration of Mysore. So they stepped in directly and they did something unique, which has never been done in a princely state, by the way. They kept, ye jo Mummadi Krishnaraj Wodeyar tha, they kept him on the throne. They didn't dislodge him, right? They kept him on the throne, but they took away even the local administration, right? They dismissed the divans and said, you go. We will set up our British administration, right? And the British administration sat in Bangalore, right? So they distanced themselves. Mysore became more culture and, very rich. Let's not forget, Ramchandra Goane, I think he has written a piece saying, you look at it up to the 60s, Mysore, the city of Mysore had spawned some great names, right? Of course, the greatest of which are, of course, the 2 Lakshman and, the brothers, R.K. Narayan and R.K. Lakshman. Right? And there are several others also, several more interesting people. So, but the administration ka jo focus tha, yahan pe Bangalore mein, they set it up in Bangalore with what was called the chief commissioners, right? They set up a chief commissioner to run the whole state, right? And the two most important chief commissioners that we have are, of course, General Sir Mark Cubbon and his successor, Lewin Bentham Bowring, right? The two succeeding. They ran the state for about 40 years. Cubbon Park or Bowring Institute, Bowring Hotel, Bowring Hospital, that's all of that. So between
और अपने
1831
श्रोताओं के लिए बता दें भाई, ये मैसूर स्टेट हम बोल रहे हैं, ये बेसिकली कर्नाटका की आज की डेट की 9 जो दक्षिण की डिस्ट्रिक्ट्स, पूरा
कर्नाटका का दक्षिण का 9 डिस्ट्रिक्ट्स,
9 डिस्ट्रिक्ट्स,
the lower part of the state of Karnataka. That's the original princely state of Mysore. North में it went up to close to Bellary. Bellary itself was not in Mysore state क्योंकि Mines जो था Madras presidency में था. Okay. Keep that in mind. And it came all the way up. यहाँ पे east में Bowringpet, Bangarpet जो station है कोलार के बगल में, that used to be called Bowringpet. That was the border between the Madras presidency and the Mysore state. South में
कोलार भी उन्होंने गोल्ड माइंस भी अपने पास रखी हुई थी मद्रास में.
Well, that's another story. I'll tell you, it's a very interesting story. And like with everything else with the British princely states, ये जो main princely states था, that is the two main ones, Hyderabad or Mysore, were both landlocked. Right? Hyderabad was landlocked. Mysore lost its port. जब 1799 में the British took over, यहाँ पे near Mangalore and around Mangalore, the two ports that were part of the old Mysore state were taken away. So the state was a landlocked state. You know? So they had no access to the sea. Another way of controlling the princely state, right? Because ultimately, अगर कुछ movement, goods का movement था, had to go through British India. Right? The 1/3, actually, you know, you mentioned it was about 40%. British India under direct control was only about 40% of all of India. 60% was by the 560 odd states. Right?
उल्टा बोला मैं.
You know, and that is the reason why you had कितना था 2 lakhs or 3 lakhs British officers in 1947 controlling the entire subcontinent. Right? And not just subcontinent, including, you know, modern day Bangladesh or Pakistan. And Burma before that. That's true. So, but coming back to Mysore, ये जो था ना, you asked about the Kolar fields. I must tell you. So, 1831 में they take over direct control of the administration of the state. So, you have this unusual situation. Princely state था, Wodeyar king था Mysore में. He ran a darbar. He did all the trappings of the state. जो, you know, pomp and circumstance, Dashera का जो celebrations था, he was there. सब हुआ था. But everything administration wise, you know, state administration, roads, water, whatever, jo bhi tha, was all irrigation, was all run by the British directly. Right?
Wow.
Now, when I say directly, that they all reported to people like Bowring and Cubbon. Right? They had obviously you know, educated Indians tha, Mysoreans, right, who ran the administration, but no longer reporting to the Darbar in Mysore. Right? Reporting to these two, right? And said, listen, we better take control. You do what you have to do. And let's not forget the fact Mumudi Krishnaraja Wodeyar is very well known for his contribution to various facets of cultural life. Right? But so that's the kind of thing. Now, 1857 jo tha, as you might have discussed elsewhere, the impact of the events of 1857 hardly touched the southern peninsula. Right? It was mostly Vindhyas ke, you know, north, right? And it hardly touched the southern peninsula. I think यहाँ पे Maharashtra, Marathas, I think they got involved a little bit, but this Mysore state was completely, you know, controlled, and the Nizam also was, you know, was clearly not supportive. So you have this British rule for 50 years, by the way, 1831 से लेकर 1881 तक, right? When the British ruled directly, right? And यानी कि मतलब वो जो chief commissioner था reported directly to the governor general, right? In Calcutta, right? Or at Fort St. George, depending on where he was, right? And then after the fall of the East India Company, you reported to the viceroy in Calcutta, right? And so it was a direct control. Mumudi Krishnaraj Wodeyar, that's the Krishnaraj Wodeyar the third, the long-serving monarch jo tha, 1868, he dies in 1868 at the age of, I think about 73 or 74. Right? So after a long 70-year-old rule, he is no more. Right? And his young son, by the way, is placed on the throne. He would have been 7 years old because ये जो 1881 का reserve, it's called in the British parlance, they resumed the administration of the state in 1831. Resumed के मतलब पहले था, I mean, in the sense we won the war, we put the Mysore Maharaja, we put him on the throne, we resumed the administration in 1831, and we gave it back in 1881. It's called the rendition, the resumption and the rendition of 1881, right? And 1881 क्यों? क्योंकि ये successor जो है Chamarajendra Wodeyar the 10th, who was the young boy that when Mummadi Krishnaraj Wodeyar the third, right? Mummadi is the Kannada word for number 3, right?
Okay.
So you'll hear this often. They will refer to him as Mummadi, right? Because that's the way of saying the third, right? Isra, right? That's Mummadi, Krishnaraj Wodeyar. So when he passes away, his heir and successor is a young boy. When he turns 18 in 1881, he is given his state back, right? And ye jo Chamarajendra Wodeyar tha, the number 10, right? He had been schooled by the British. He had British tutors, British governors, palace mein tha, but all his training was in English, right? In other words, in another context, Indian in appearance, but English in disposition, right? So that's how they created him, and they said, listen, you're turning 18, we'll give you your state back, you can resume it, right? You can resume it, we will rendition it back to you, right? And so in 1881, they passed the state back in a fine, they called it the best. It's the finest of the Indian tradition, because you have the Maharaja who's doing all this good work. He's much loved, by the way. I mean, I'll go so far as to say that if in 1881 they had an election, the Maharaja would have won hands down, right? Because he was so well regarded and popular with his people. And you had this well-run state that was now handed back. And just before I close on this point, this thing about the different parts of the Mysore state, very unusual again. The Bangalore cantonment जो था ना, वो old Fort Pete area के बाहर था, right? They helped create a cantonment town, right, for the British officers. And the only reason they created the cantonment is क्योंकि वो जो मच्छर का problem था मैसूर में, they ran away from it, right? Because they said, let's set it up in the hills, 3,000 feet above mean sea level, wonderful climate, reminds us of home, all of that, right? And the Scotsman, let's not, I say this and sometimes say it in jest, one of the leading parts of the East India Company army was Scotsmen. And they loved in Mysore, especially Coorg and other parts of the state, because it reminded them of home, right? The glens, the long, the hills and the sweeping, valleys that they would have at home, it reminded them. So they were very clear. They wanted to set up their cantonment. They set it up in Bangalore. Now, ये जो Mysore, it was part of the Mysore state cantonment, what we call the cantonment area of Bangalore. So what do they do? Very, again, classic British ingenuity, if you want to call it that, or, administrative brilliance. They said, ये जो है cantonment area, उसको we'll cordon it off, right? And you give it back to me. You lease it to me.
अच्छा.
Right? So it was called the Civil and Military Station of Bangalore.
अच्छा.
आपको अगर
ये 1881 में ऐसा हुआ था, बोल रहे हैं.
This was done even before. This was done in 1810, because the Civil and Military Station, the cantonment of Bangalore, was created in 1810, 1810.
Okay.
And ये जो अगर if you're driving from BBMP का जो office है, Hudson Circle, Hudson Church, on Kasturba Road, if you're driving towards the cricket stadium, वहाँ पे ये जो UB City का junction है ना, Cafe Coffee Day का headquarters, वहाँ पे there used to be a gate right up to the 1940s or 50s separating the cantonment from the city. और वो जो regulation था, क्योंकि अगर you came in with a cycle, for instance, you had to pay a little fee, right? Or if you had other vehicle, you had to pay a fee to run the vehicle in the cantonment, because that's British administration, ये Mysore administration, right? Right? Although for 50 years the two were the same, so that's another thing. But ये imaginary concept create किया था कि ये जो civil and military station, sometimes called the assigned tract of Bangalore. The assigned tract was a tract that they assigned to themselves, leased to themselves, right? They did the same thing with the Kolar goldfields, by the way, because they wanted control of it. Mysore territory tha, right? Lekin we will lease it through the corporation, Bharat Goldfields, or whatever it is called. It is called the Imperial Goldfields, or jo bhi tha, right? To lease it back. In fact, and I'm now running ahead of the story, I'll stop here on this point. in 1930s, 20s or 30s में the Mysore government told the government in Fort St. George, the colonial administration, said, यार हमारा जो रेंट जो है बैंगलोर का इट्स बहुत कम है, उसको थोड़ा इंक्रीज कर दीजिए. तो ब्रिटिश रिप्लाइड, इफ यू इंक्रीज द रेंट फ्रॉम बैंगलोर वी विल इंक्रीज द ट्रिब्यूट, राइट? So there was a big fight.
अच्छा.
यहाँ ये जो इंक्रीज का ट्रिब्यूट, they finally managed to win. It was both many divans later, finally under Mirza Ismail, they got an increase in the rent and a slight reduction in the tribute, so that there was some kind of economic parity between the two. But this is how they extracted value.
नहीं, ये तो बहुत ही दिलचस्प कहानी बताई आपने सिद्धार्थ. लेकिन इसमें मैं एक चीज जानना चाहता हूँ, जैसे मैसूर अभी कितना समृद्ध, आजादी के दौरान भी समृद्ध राज्य था, और वो जो चीज हुई, इन्वेस्टमेंट इन एजुकेशन, इन्वेस्टमेंट इन सोशल सर्विसेज, तो ये आप देखते हैं कब हुआ? ये वो 1831 के बाद की चीज है, जब वो कबन या बोरिंग थे, तब की बात हुई, या फिर ये 1881 के बाद की चीज?
गुड क्वेश्चन.
सिद्धार्थ, मैं इसी के साथ एक अपना सप्लीमेंट्री क्वेश्चन जोड़ देती हूँ. तो ये जो चेंज उन्होंने वापस दे दिया वोडियार्स को, ये चेंज कुछ रीजन की वजह से हुआ कि वो बस डेलीगेट कर देना चाहते थे, उसकी वजह से हुआ?
अच्छा, I'll answer that first. I think 50 साल के बाद I think they realize कि हमारा डायरेक्ट इन्वॉल्वमेंट जो है अभी तो बंद होना चाहिए. It had to come to an end. क्योंकि ये जो डाइकोटमी था between the Maharaja and them, you know, the Maharaja on the throne but the administration run by the British, ये जो halfway house था ब्रिटिश इंडिया और प्रिंसली स्टेट का बीचों बीच 50-50 था. तो it had to end soon, because I think थोड़ा, you know, I think I'm just conjecturing, the local जो administration था would have wondered कि हम British administration में हैं कि, you know, are we Mysore administration, right? Maybe, and इसको थोड़ा study करना पड़ेगा, maybe there was an economic reason for that. Like everything else that I'm thinking, the British had to think with an economic reason. If they kept on too long running the administration of the state, maybe the local Mysore administration will start claiming central benefits, right? And like we have it today, na? You know, अगर आप महाराष्ट्र गवर्नमेंट का एम्प्लॉई है, you get Maharashtra state benefit. अगर you are a PSU, if you work for you know, Airports Authority of India and Bombay Airport, you'll get central benefit. तो ये dichotomy जो था, they must have some people must have said, यार मेरे को central benefits, central DA. I mean, I'm just giving you, I'm making a joke out of it, but I think there was some potential claim that the people would, the administrators would forget who they are serving. Is it their loyalty with the king or Maharaja and Mysore, या फिर Fort St. George? You know. Okay. So that rendition happened because I think they realized कि time हुआ है, we need to give this back. This Maharaja is a decent guy because he's now schooled by us. Chamarajendra Wodeyar the 10th was a well-regarded man. He had just turned 18, right? And you know, and so they going back to the administration 81, I think it was 50 years plus he had turned 18, so they gave it back, right? And I think it was just a sense that it was time to give back, because otherwise they were to run the entire administration from Fort St. George, which was a lot of money and effort, right? So they much rather give it back to an administration which, as I said, may be native in origin but very British in disposition, right? So it was all meant, it was very aligned with the British.
और एक चीज पता नहीं सिद्धार्थ, ये मैसूर के केस में थी कि नहीं, पर जनरली मुझे लगता था कि ऐसा ब्रिटिशर पहले पुराने काफी एम्पायर्स का होता था, ना ही सिर्फ ब्रिटिश एम्पायर का, कि लोकल राजा अगर लोकल एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन के लिए तरह रहे तो रिवोल्ट होने के चांस कम हो जाते हैं. पब्लिक जो है, अगर आपको ग्रीवेंस भी है तो आपको राजा के साथ होगी, ब्रिटिशर्स के साथ थोड़ी होगा कि हम थोड़ी आते हैं तुम्हारी डे टू डे प्रॉब्लम्स में करने के लिए.
वो, एंड बाय द वे, ये आप, you know, what you are saying is not, it precedes even the British, by the way. हमारा
रोमन भी ऐसे करते थे. रोमन
नहीं, you talk of India, विजयनगर के एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन में भी ऐसा था. How did the Vijayanagar empire grow like that? You are not going to control Tanjavur. You will appoint some Raja in Tanjavur and then let him run the thing. And that man would pay you some money. And what would you give in return? You would give it happens, आज भी होता है. You give a huge donation to the largest temple, right? For example, right? You create a temple and say, this is donated by Wodeyar Maharaja, right? And there it is. You have allegiance. But I think that is also absolutely true. Coming back to Pranay's question, ये जो what should I say, what Mysore is known for its various, especially for education,
prosperity generally,
prosperity in general, I think it is a continuum. I don't think you can say 1831 में शुरू हुआ था या फिर 81 में शुरू हुआ था. I think the fact remains is the British looted and plundered Mysore after the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War. There is no doubt about that, right? They let their troops loose. Tipu and his palace and all of it was ransacked, right? And we know about all the famous stuff that exists in all the museums overseas.
Right.
But there was a lot of money that they made, right? Personal, right? And the administration was in the doldrums. So it had to come out, right? And I think the point is the Wodeyar king were benevolent. They were known to be good in administration. I mean, later on, of course, there was that 50-year gap tha. But, as I said, his contribution, Mummadi Krishnaraja Wodeyar's contribution to music, to art, to food, all of that has happened over those many years that he was there, right? And the continuation of the administration and its values, British values, so to speak, is a continuous process all the way through. But the point is, from 1881 onwards until 1947, what is that? So roughly 65 years, 66 years. That 66 years is perhaps the golden period of clearly one of the best run princely states in this country, right? And I say that not only because I'm from here, but I think records also show that. There were three well-known, well-governed princely states. There was the Gaikwad in Baroda, and there were the Travancore Cochin, the much smaller states, both the Raja of Cochin and the Travancore Maharaja, also well-governed, also very forward-looking, modern in its outlook, etc. But clearly Mysore was the largest and the best run.
सिद्धार्थ, इसमें मैं ये पूछना चाहता था, क्योंकि ये स्पेक्यूलेशन है, इसमें मैं ढंग से तो कह नहीं सकता, लेकिन क्योंकि आप जैसे कह रहे थे कि अंग्रेजों को बैंगलोर पसंद भी था, उसका वातावरण पसंद था वगैरह, तो हम जैसे थियरीज पढ़ते हैं ना, एक स्टेशनरी बैंडिट वर्सेस रोइंग बैंडिट, मतलब स्थायी डाकू और अस्थायी डाकू. तो जैसे कोई जो डाकू रहता है जो एक जगह पर स्थायी नहीं है, उसको कोई इंसेंटिव नहीं रहता पब्लिक गुड्स में इन्वेस्ट करने के लिए या फिर कुछ स्थिति को बेहतर बनाने के लिए, क्योंकि वो सिर्फ लूट के चला जाएगा. लेकिन अगर एक स्टेशनरी बैंडिट होगा तो उसके हित में है कि वो उस चीज का उद्धार करे जिससे उसको टैक्स भी मिले वगैरह वगैरह. तो ये स्पेक्यूलेशन है कि क्या ऐसे था, शायद ब्रिटिशर्स को पसंद था, इसलिए 1831 से 1881 तक भी उन्होंने बेहतरी चाहिए इस साम्राज्य की, ना सिर्फ लूट चाहिए. तो ये स्पेक्यूलेशन के बारे में आप क्या कहते हैं?
आई थिंक आई थिंक यहाँ पे भी डाइकोटमी है, क्योंकि ये जो colonial administration था ना, their most important economic reason again was the ability to get this annual tribute, right? And the annual tribute is a direct relationship with the state of the administration. अगर आपका revenue records अच्छा है, अगर आपका mapping systems अच्छा है, and then you will get the best revenue, right? In the process, the princely state also gets its revenue. That is true, right? But the British administration sitting in Fort St. George is saying, we have to this is a very rich state. It's also, remember, it's also the rice bowl, the 9 southern districts, current districts of Mandya, Mysore, Srirangapatna, all of them are agriculturally very rich states, right? And so their extraction of value comes from the administration being quiet. I think less trouble, less disruption, better extraction. So your Daku, as you called it, right, sitting in Bangalore, is keen that this administration runs properly, right? And on the other hand, you have the local administration who, I think, and this is I'm saying this, this is the popular belief, and I think it's generally correct, that the Mysore administration that emerges in 1881, governed by a very strong Maharaja, right? And both Chamarajendra Wodeyar the 10th, who's there from 1881 to 1894 or 92, I can't quite remember the date. he dies young. He's only 32 or 33 when he dies, right? And his son and successor, most famous Wodeyar Maharaja, clearly of the modern age, that is Nalvadi. That's the fourth Krishnaraja Wodeyar, who's there from 1894 all the way 1895, if I'm not mistaken, all the way up to 1940. And the last Mysore Maharaja, the well-known Jayachamaraja Wodeyar, right, who's there until 1940. And these three kings, right, are, I think, they're all well educated, and I think they genuinely have the welfare of their people and the state in mind, right? Because I think it comes from a very different sense of kingship. And I think we should not forget the fact that this was a enlightened rule. It was an autocracy. Let's not forget it. Democracy was not there. They gave in a little later to some limited form of representation, right? Which again is another forerunner of what comes in modern India. But it's clearly a benevolent, well-run, and they realize that these are things that they need to give back to the people, right? And so these three kings, and it must not be forgotten, they're very enlightened set of divans or prime ministers, all the way from Rangacharlu, the gentleman who takes over as Diwan in 1881, all the way up to Mudalayar, Arcot Ramaswamy Mudalayar in 1946-47, right? There are 10 or 12 Diwans, and they're all fairly, very well enlightened and clearly looking at an administrative. They're actually fine-tuned they created a Mysore administrative service, by the way, in the 1890s, right? To mimic the Indian civil service, your ICS, right? They created a Mysore administrative service because they realized that they needed a cadre of people to run the state. Now, I think it's coming from a place where there's genuinely good administrators, right? In fact, I sometimes joke with some people in government here. I say, look at what it was then and where we've come, right? Right? Because, I'll give you an example. And it's a famous letter that is available. In 1927, when Nalvadi Krishnaraj Wodeyar celebrates 25 years on the throne in his own right, as a major, he writes a letter, by the way, that is written in his own hand to all his people, right? It's issued, it's whatever, cyclostyled or copied or whatever and sent out. And the letter written in three languages. It's in English, in Kannada, and in Urdu, right? And he talks about how he is grateful for having had the chance to run the state, right? And that ultimately whatever he is doing is for the benefit of the state as a whole, right? His country, his nation, as he called it, right? The Mysore state. So I think it's a genuine belief. And the Nalvadi Krishnaraj Wodeyar in particular was one very enlightened, and we'll talk about him in a bit, but I guess I'm now running ahead of myself. I'll leave it back to you to, let's move the needle forward from the mid 1880s into the 20th century.
तो एक्चुअली जो आपने अभी बताया ना कि उस समय के राजाओं के बाकी राजाओं की भी कहानी जब सुनते हैं तो ऐसा लगता है कि 1800s के एंड तक आई थिंक बहुत सारे प्रिंसली स्टेट्स के एटीट्यूड्स में भी बहुत बदलाव आया था। शायद उनको ये दुनिया जो बदल रही थी वो जो परसेप्शन उनको भी फील होने लगा था और वो अपनी एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन उस हिसाब से बदलने की कोशिश कर रहे थे। बिकॉज तभी अगर आप देखो तो टी माधवराव सयाजीराव गायकवाड़ के गुरु होते हैं ना, वो उनको सिखाते हैं। तो उन समय की वो पहली ट्रीटीज वगैरह के बारे में बात कर रहे हैं।
उस बारे में एक नया बुक भी लिखा है लास्ट ईयर और ईयर बिफोर। वेरी गुड, या
हाँ, तो आई थिंक ये एक जनरल उस समय का एक थ्रेड था शायद कि जिसमें लोगों की इवन जो प्रिंसली स्टेट्स की मानसिकता और उनकी एटीट्यूड्स टुवर्ड्स एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन शायद बदल रहा था उस समय के हिसाब से।
करेक्ट। एक टू एरियाज
पर क्या थी इसमें एक चीज लेकिन ऐड कर सकता हूँ, 575 राजाओं में कुछ 5-10 ही ढंग के थे, लेकिन
and some of them were not just useless, some of them were malevolent also. क्योंकि ये सब जो take all your money and go and buy Rolls Royce and spend money, spend half your time in Switzerland and in other fancy places in Europe and and blow up all the money, right? So वो तो है. Like I think, as I said, ये जो well administered states था, I think there must have been a handful or two handful, let me put it, and in two areas, by the way, I'll address that. I think largely it is education and it is social upliftment. Right? Now, I know there are anecdotes. For example, let us not forget that Dr. Ambedkar went to Columbia for his legal studies on a scholarship provided by the Gaikwad Maharaja, the Baroda Maharaja, right? and went to England, to the US for that, Columbia, right? You have, coming to the princely state of Mysore, you have the first, again, these are maybe little bits and pieces. Some people have criticized it by saying these were little, thoda, drops in the ocean tha, in the extractive, colonial, rapacious kind of system that was run. But fact is that the first modern university in India, right? Well, outside of British India, Madras ka university tha, Calcutta University, Bombay, all of that tha. But the first university outside of British India was the University of Mysore, set up in 1917, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Okay.
At the behest of Nalvadi Krishnaraja Wodeyar, saying we must have an institution of eminence of our own, right? And let us not forget, the first founding vice chancellor of the Banaras Hindu University was the Maharaja of Mysore, right? Nalvadi Krishnaraja
सौरभ, पता था क्या आपको?
नहीं, मुझे नहीं पता था ये चीज.
Yeah, there were two. See,
पर मैं
what's his
इसमें
name?
ये ऐड करना चाहता था, शायद वो उस टाइम पे मे बी ही गॉट इंस्पायर्ड क्योंकि 1914 या 15 में बीएचयू शुरू हुआ था. तो हो सकता है कि क्योंकि महाराजा इन्वॉल्व सारे और काफी प्रिंसली राजाओं ने मिलकर बीएचयू को सपोर्ट किया था, तो शायद उससे इंस्पिरेशन
There were
मिला.
two of them. You see, Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya jo tha, he came along with a begging bowl to the Maharajas, saying, "Give me some money." Right? 1914-15. You're absolutely correct. And only two of them put up their hands. I think Maharaja of Mysore and wo Dharangadara ka princely state, if I'm not mistaken.
नहीं, पैसे तो बहुतों ने दिए थे, मुझे पता है, जम्मू कश्मीर के राजा ने भी दिए थे वगैरह. बेसिकली मालवीय जी के साथ में जो दरभंगा राजा थे,
दरभंगा,
प्रेसिडेंट थे एक्चुअली. तो दरभंगा के जो राजा थे, उन्होंने सारे प्रिंसली, उनकी काफी प्रिंसली स्टेट्स में इज्जत थी, एंड दरभंगा राजा जो थे, उन्होंने सारे प्रिंसली स्टेट्स को इकट्ठा करके सपोर्ट लिया और प्लस ब्रिटिश से भी सपोर्ट लिया. मालवीय जी का ब्रिटिशर से रिलेशनशिप कोई अच्छा नहीं था, बट महाराजाओं का अच्छा था. तो दरभंगा राजा ने ब्रिटिशर से काफी जो उनके एजुकेशन सेक्रेटरी थे, हर्बर्ट, ये जो HBTI जिनके नाम पर है college, right? Well, he was the education secretary, so he supported.
But fact remains that Maharaja Mysore was the first chancellor. He was the one who delivered the convocation lecture, for the first convocation lecture, 1918 or 19 May. He was the one who delivered it, right? And Darbhanga, you're absolutely right. Remember, a lot of these Maharajas were also interconnected through marriage. Many of them had their sons and daughters married off to other Maharajas. So, it was a little a clique to that extent, of that. So, I mean, so I'm talking about education, for instance. But the other thing that some of the Mysore is well known for is the efforts made at backward classes, betterment, to upliftment, right? And I think, history records that I think the very first reservations made in India was actually done by the Kolhapur Raja. I've forgotten his name, but he was the one who issued an order in 1907 or 1908, reserving posts for non-Brahmins, for the backward classes in government departments. But the biggest one by far, and the one that created a lot of controversy in Mysore is the reservations of 1921-22, right? Let's not forget that if we talk about reservations in government service, in government posts, Mysore has completed 100 years of reservations in government posts. It goes back to 1921, right? With under Nalvadi Krishnaraja Wodeyar. Because he said, I mean, the fact remains is that 3% of the state Brahmins controlled 99% of the state posts in 1920. He says we have to break that. And it was a determined Maharaja. The story has to be told. I think it's a story well worth researching and telling. How he stood up, and he stood up against the opposition of his Diwan, Sir M. Vishwesharaya, who said, no, you will kill meritocracy if you do this. Right? A classic argument. Right? To which, of course, Maharaja replied saying, all well and good for you to say that, Sir M.V., right? Because you're a product of that system. Right? I'm a product of this system. Right? We have to break it for the people who aren't. Right? And so and as a result, in 1918, as a result of this decision initially taken, Sir Vishwesharaya resigned, saying, I'm leaving. I'm going. Because I don't see eye to eye with my Maharaj. I respect him a lot. He respects me a lot. But on this decision, we agree to disagree. Right? And I'll go my way because he's after all the Maharaja. But 1921, they pushed through fairly important set of reforms on this government posts were being allocated to non-Brahmins. 1921 is also the year, 21-22 is also the year the princely state allows a limited franchise vote for women in the state. And I think one of the questions you have raised, Pranay, is that did it have an assembly of its own? In 1881 or 1883, the Mysore state created its own legislative assembly. It's called the Representative Assembly. It had representatives from the people. When I say from the people, it was landed. You had to have a certain income qualification, this, that, and the rest, right? But you had a representative assembly, didn't have much power. It was only recommendatory to the Maharaja and the Tabar. But it brought together, there are debates after debates. In fact, the Mysore assembly debates are quite fascinating. Right?
अच्छा, ये है क्या सिद्धार्थ? ये किताबें
Yes.
हैं 1881
Yes.
के बाद जो
Yes.
लेजिस्लेटिव असेंबली डिबेट्स हो रहे हैं?
Yes, the legislative assembly, representative assembly debates are there all the way from 1883 to 1947, right?
अच्छा.
And they are organized depending on the speeches or the debates that have occurred given the divanship. So you will have the collected speeches and the interjections of Sir M. Vishwesharaya in his time, then the other divan. But it's all there. The material exists, right, and has been published in the past by the government press, Mysore press, right? And so in 1921-22, they allow a certain limited franchise for women, right? Saying women who have lands, etc., can vote, right? So that's another progressive movement, right? These two, the land, and then of course he starts looking at land reforms, which of course comes much later. Ultimately, he doesn't bite that bullet. It's too much opposition to land reforms. That is a project for independent India to do, right? Once the British have left. But I think there's this series of things that are occurring, and as I said, probably gone a little ahead of the game on that. But it's because of a progressive, to your point, because of a progressive Maharaja and his progressive administration led by top officials who are selected. Remember, these are not elected prime ministers. They're all hand-picked, right, by the Maharaja. So they share the same, whatever, outlook.
सिद्धार्थ, तो फिर ऐसे प्रॉस्पेरस प्रिंसली स्टेट के अंदर भारत का जो इंडिपेंडेंस मूवमेंट था वो कैसे शेप हो रहा था? क्या इस मामले में हो रहा था चीजें कि क्या था मामला?
A very interesting question. See, I'll divide that into two parts. ये जो पहला फेज जो है 1881 से लेकर 1920 तक, right? Approximately 1919, I would say. That first phase of the princely state's existence as its own is matched by a fairly docile national movement, right? You have, what goes on in the rest of India. You have, they're trying to petition the government कि हमको इस यहाँ पे, give me a little concession, ये वो, Then, of course, all of that changes with Gandhi's emergence in the national stage,
yes,
right? And especially the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919 and the consequences of it. So until then, I think the state is fairly like most of the India is insulated. At least princely India is insulated twice over, right? Because, the princely state is also fairly well run. You have a bunch of progressive measures over the 1890s all the way up to the late teens up to 1920. And of course, the most important progressive measure is something that the princely state of Mysore did virtually in the teeth of strong opposition from the colonial administration. And that is the building of the dam at Kannambadi, the KRS, the Krishnaraja Sagar Dam, in 1913. 1913, 1914 is finally when he builds it, Vishwesharaya, because he pushes it through, right? And the British, believe you me, are miffed, right? That there is this gentleman who can do this. He is trained by us. He's perhaps more English than many other Indians, right? Sir Vishwesharaya, right? But he pushes this through saying this upper riparian state must get the benefit of the water, right? Because he knows he's fighting a losing battle against Madras, right? The lower state. The successor states, of course, finally had to solve it, the issue, Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, right? But that is a most progressive means. So I think the general prosperity jo tha Mysore mein wasn't really affected by the national movement. But then you have this conflagration, 1919, the civil disobedience movement of 2021. The princely state is untouched, right? The Mysore princely state, for two reasons. I think, firstly, because of the continuation of these progressive measures. ये coincidence नहीं था कि 2021-22 में reservations get introduced, women का vote, other legislative means. They're all meant to counter कि, there also must be some pressure from the British saying, listen, there's all this trouble in British India. You keep control of your state. You do it progressively. You run a progressive administration. So the real impact of the national movement in Mysore doesn't happen until the year 1938. Local Congress ka working committee, what do you call it? Local unit tha Mysore mein, right? They were well-known leaders. One of them went on to become the first chief minister of independent of our the state of Mysore and independent India. His name is K.C. Reddy. He was the president of the Congress, right, in 1920s and 30s, right? But it's again a very petition-oriented, and there is this tussle that they have because the Mysore administration is well run. In fact, let's not forget, in 1926 or 27, when Gandhi is visiting Mysore, he says, and correct, and words to this effect, saying that the administration of Mysore is Ram Raja, right? Right. So he recognizes that there is a well-run Indian administration, right? So the administration and the Congress is jostling. Unfortunately, our national movement also goes through ups and downs. Civil disobedience movement, then there's a sudden lull. Then you have the round table. So there's not much until 1942, really. It's a seesaw battle, right, for Indian national movement. But the real impact of the national movement in the princely state of Mysore, surprisingly, can be actually dated to a single incident in 1938, right? I think it was in June or July. I can't remember when. Not far from Chikbalapur, from where I live actually, is a town called Gauribidanur, right, which is in what was then Kolar district, right? And next to Gauribidanur is an even more well-known ashram town called Vidurashwatha, right? Vidura, that famous story, right, that he comes when after the Mahabharata he comes to this place. He sees a sapling of the kya bolta hai, ye people ka ped, right? And then so therefore the name Vidurashwatha. He plants it, it becomes a big tree, etc. There is a gathering of people. It's called the Mysore State's Jallianwala Bagh, right? Because there is a peaceful demonstration, and the police fire upon the demonstration, right? There are reportedly, I think official reports only talk of about 10 or 12 deaths. Maybe unofficial, maybe about 40 or 50. But it's the spark that lights the national movement in the state. Because, and I said this only a few days ago on another forum, the Mysore administration, the princely state, the Diwan at the time, Sir Mirza Ismail and his administration, were perhaps complicit in letting the firing happen, right? And I think that there's a kind of a sudden divide between, national movement who regarded the Mysore state well, saying, no, now it's time. And I think it's also, pent up energy tha. Let us not forget that in the South, again, it's a very different national movement. Huh? We talk about all the civil disobedience, all of that. The South, it was a very different movement because the principal focus of the movement in the South, and I'm now going on to another terrain, you look at what happens in princely Madras, right? The fight is not with, national movement. The fight is for emancipation of backward classes, right? You have the Justice Party, you have that entire movement saying the Dravida movement comes up, right? And all of them, EVR, Nayakar, Periyar is there, and you have Anna Durai a little later on, right? Pushing for the emancipation of the backward classes, right? Because their strongest, what should I say? Devta is Mahatma Gandhi, right? He runs that famous Andolan in Tamil Nadu, in Kerala, the temple entry movement.
Entry movement.
So, it's driven by the backward classes issue. And Ambedkar is still in the background. He's still fighting a legal battle, mostly, right? But it's Gandhi's movement, right? Untouchability has to be removed, right? That in the 1930s, when he starts that famous, he goes to meet Narayan Guru in Kerala, right? And says, let's break the doors of the temple open for the untouchables, right? All of this is coming together, and this is a spark which sets it off. And so to your question, the national movement is there, but it really gains traction in the late 1930s, the last decade before independence.
और वो 39 में उन्होंने ऑल इंडिया प्रिंसली स्टेट्स कॉन्फ्रेंस भी बनाई थी, जिसमें उन्होंने जवाहरलाल नेहरू उसके हेड बना दिए थे, थिंकिंग कि भाई जब भी आई थिंक दे वर एंटिसिपेटिंग एनीवे कि इंडिपेंडेंस होना है तो प्रिंसली स्टेट्स को एक साथ कैसे रखेंगे, तो एक ऑल इंडिया प्रिंसली स्टेट्स कॉन्फ्रेंस बनी थी विद नेहरू एज द हेड ऑफ इट. तो आई थिंक वो 39 में बनी, तो उसके बाद थोड़ा सा ये सारी प्रिंसली स्टेट्स में किया होगा, तो आई थिंक मैसूर भी आया. लेकिन आप कह रहे हैं आंदोलन वाली चीज मैसूर में उतनी हुई नहीं जैसे बाकी
सिर्फ ये एक इंसिडेंट, it's called the Jallianwala Bagh of Mysore. It's actually there. It's commemorated. वहाँ पे अभी if you go there now, there is a proper monument to the firing at Vidurashwatha, right? And in honor of the people who fell, and most of them Congress workers, right?
इसके बारे में बिल्कुल पता नहीं था. हाँ.
Yeah. It's a very famous movement because, as I said, ये implication था. They hushed it up क्योंकि I think the administration they allowed the police to do this, right? And I think it came back to bite Mirza Ismail a few years later, right? When he had to suddenly resign. I mean, not because of this. I'm not suggesting it was only because of this. There were other reasons, of course. Most important reason is that his main benefactor, the Nalvadi Krishnaraja Wodeyar, dies in 1940, right? And but incidentally, historical trivia again, Mirza Ismail and Nalvadi Krishnaraj Wodeyar were classmates, right? Mirza Ismail was actually a police officer, incidentally, right? He went on to join the Mysore police force before he was called by his friend and Maharaja back to run the state, right? Many years later. He ran it for 15 years from 1926 to 1941. Right? He was there.
ठीक है, जयपुर का भला हो गया थोड़ा, मिर्जा इस्माइल वहां चले गए तो अभी भी फेमस एमआई रोड है वहां पे.
ट्रैवलिंग दीवान्स का कॉन्सेप्ट जो है, साइड बार very interesting note on that, by the way. Most of them were South Indian Brahmins, right? Now, I've heard it famously said that the British administration, the princely administration also had basically Brahmins from five distinct categories of Brahmins. You had the Bengali Brahmin, you had your UP Brahmin, right? Then you had the Kashmiri Brahmins, then you had the Tamil Brahmins, and you had the Kerala. Then. So you would have the Chatterjees, the Mukherjees, or the Banerjees, or you've had the Srivastavs, or give me some more names there, right? Or you'll have the your Haksar and the Nehrus, of thing, or you'll have the Subramaniams or the Swaminathans of Tamil Nadu, or the Nayars or the thing. So many of them, by the way, are traveling divans. Consider this: most of the divans of the princely state of Mysore were technically outsiders, right? Rangacharlu is a Telugu divan, Telugu Brahmin. Sir M. Vishweshwaraya is originally from Telugu, again Brahmin, right? Then you have all your Madhav Rao, and there was one more whose name eludes me at the moment, are Maharashtra, you're either Konkanasta or
Tanjore Brahmins. Yeah, those are
the Tanjore Brahmins, or you'll have correct, right? And then, of course, in the midst of all of that, my favorite topic is you have a Bengali Brahmin as well, right? Who's Diwan of Mysore, right? Banerjee, Sir Albion Banerjee. And then, of course, the outsider amongst all of this, but again, upper class, certainly, is Sir Mirza. Right, who is Shia, educated. It's a completely different outlook on the Muslim world, really. But coming back to the point, so I think you have these. This is the state of affairs in princely Mysore. It was, as I said, many people look back on it with nostalgia and say, well-run administration. You had water supply schemes, irrigation schemes, well laid out roads. Right, Mysore is a standing testimony to what they did. Right, as the capital. Bangalore is a little bit of a different thing because you had the cantonment, but it was a different set of administrative issues over there. But I think one point that one of the questions is, what is the relationship between the princely states and its various neighbors? Right. I think the closest relationship that it had to have was its relationship with what is called the hegemonic power. Right. Remember, in the analysis, historical analysis of this, ye do cheez hota hai. Hegemon hai. The superior, what is called, the British called it the paramount power, right? That's the British administration. And then you have the subsidiary or the vassal states. So their biggest relationship had to be with Fort St. George, right? And the the one issue that defines the tension between the princely state and the British administration is the Kaveri waters dispute, right? Which has existed until solved we don't know if it's been solved or not, but there was a conclusive Supreme Court decision 5 years ago. 1892 se lekar all the way to 2018. It dominated much of the political life of the state, right? You have the 1892 waters agreement, then you have an arbitration jo tha 1912 1913 mein, then the 1924 waters agreement, and then later on all the various efforts. But the tension between Madras presidency, the paramount power, and the subsidiary power is very telling. And Karnataka has always, by the way, in the Supreme Court, the Karnataka took that view, by the way. Historically, they demonstrated it. कि ये जो 60 साल जो था, this under British administration, we got the wrong end of the deal in the treatment. It was not a treaty that was between equals, right?
Of course.
It was not. Fali Nariman argued it quite convincingly in court, saying that you have to disregard many of that. Look at what modern Karnataka has done. Let's deal with it as a post-independence issue. But that's the first relationship. I think the other relationship that clearly would have had some, influence was, in the sense, neighboring states, if you look at it, princely Mysore was almost completely landlocked by British India. It was all Madras presidency in the south or in the east, or north mein or northwest mein Bombay presidency tha. So they really didn't have another princely state neighboring them, right? The only large neighboring state, in some manner of speaking, is Nizam, the Hyderabad. But that was less of a thing. You had a number of smaller states, and I'll end by saying this. Ye jo chota, because as you said, you had all these 500 or 555, 65 states. One of them, some of the small principalities, still exists, by the way, is the Maharaja of Sandur, right?
Achha.
That's the Maratha Maharaja of Ghorpade, right? The Ghorpade Maharaja. In fact, they worked so closely with the Mysore state, right, that over the many generations of the Ghorpade royal family in Sandur, some of them continued to become well-known political leaders in modern-day Karnataka. There was a gentleman called M.Y. Ghorpade, right, who was the successor, one of the, I think the last Maharaja's son, if I'm not mistaken, or he may have been for a short while Maharaja himself. He was finance minister in Devaraj Arsi's government, right? So there's been and to take the traveling divan story further, many of them went on to become many prominent figures elsewhere, na? Baroda mein, Jaipur mein. Albion Banerjee went, by the way, to Kashmir, incidentally, right, as foreign and political minister. And he made it a point to, when he resigned, I should say this, he made it a point to say the difference between the two Maharajas are chalk and cheese, right? Here I am dealing with you, you're hardly present in the state, right? Talking about Hari Singh, right? But he says over there, that man was completely engaged in his administration, right? And so it's this, I think they were all jostling for power and position ultimately, na? Let's not forget they were also fairly wealthy, the Wodeyars. But anyway, I'll stop on that in terms of...
एक थोड़ा अलग क्वेश्चन मेरे को पूछना था आखिरी शायद, सिद्धार्थ, ये बताइए, मैसूर स्टेट की एक अलग पहचान मुझे जो दिखती है, वो बड़ी इंडस्ट्रियल स्टेट थी. तो यहाँ पे काफी लोकल इंडस्ट्री थी, टेक्नोलॉजी पर्सपेक्टिव से. यहाँ पर मतलब प्लेन भी बना रहे थे ये लोग. पहला HAL का प्रिकर्सर इधर था, और मैसूर सोप फैक्ट्री वगैरह इस तरह से. तो ये बाकी हिंदुस्तान में तो दिखता नहीं था. वो ज्यादातर या तो प्राइवेट लोग कर रहे थे या कुछ. यहाँ पर स्टेट ड्रिवन इंडस्ट्रियलाइजेशन बहुत था मैसूर में. तो इसका ये ऐसा, और इस चीज में मेरे ख्याल से यूनिक है मैसूर. बाकी मुझे तो नहीं एटलीस्ट पता कि हिंदुस्तान में और कहीं ऐसा स्टेट ड्रिवन इंडस्ट्रियलाइजेशन.
Absolutely right. And that is the result of, if you ask me, the result of one man, Sir M. Vishweswaraya, right? Because he was the one who drove it, right? And of course, there is that well-known debate, दूसरे जगह पे, that famous Bombay club, let there be capitalism. And Vishweswaraya takes a view about the kind of economy that a state must have. We must drive it by the government must drive it to some extent, that classic debate. But Vishweswaraya is responsible for almost all of the industrial establishments that the old Mysore state had.
Achha.
Right? In conjunction with the Maharaja, of course. Let's not forget that he could not have done anything without the without the backing of the Maharaja, that's most important. Which is why I say a book is well worth researching and writing about the relationship between Nalvadi Krishnaraj Wodeyar and Sir M. Vishwesharaya, right? Because it must have been, Vishwesharaya was a good 23 or 24 years older than the Maharaja,
अच्छा
right? So, but he stood his ground. Vishwesharaya had his own views, right? And, ultimately, I think they were guided by this principle of what is best for the state. So, most of this industrialization actually occurs under Vishwesaraya's tenure and right through from then. So, from the early 20th century all the way up to the 1930s and the 40s, right? So, you have, Bhadravati Iron and Steel Works. By the way, that's the big one that was created under Vishwesharaya. It subsequently becomes a bit of a white elephant, but he's called back to revive it, incidentally, because remember, I should not forget, I think it's a piece of trivia again. Vishwesharaya was on the board of Tata Sons for many years.
Achha.
Yeah, in the 30s, right? Because he was so well regarded, right? As an engineer statesman who knew his stuff, and he was very well educated about the world. Of course, British India, I mean, he knew the British well, but he also had an endearing closeness and friendship with people in Japan. Because he traveled to Japan often before the war, Second World War, and he truly admired them for what they were doing, right? So, ये जो industrialization है is all because of him. Iron and steel works.
तो ये बेसिकली पहले इंजीनियर थे जो कि प्राइम मिनिस्टर बन गए, किसी स्टेट के दीवान बन गए, तो वो एक इंजीनियर का एक दीवान बनने से ये एक चेंज आया, क्योंकि बाकी जगह पे शायद सब लॉयर और इस टाइप के लोग थे. आई मीन, नो ऑफेंस टू यू सिद्धार्थ, बट या
No, that's true. Yeah, that's true. He was a civil engineer, by the way. Correct. Well,
राइट, सिविल इंजीनियर थे विश्वेश्वरैया. उस जमाने में दो ही इंजीनियरिंग थी ना, मैकेनिकल और सिविल इंजीनियरिंग की तो होती थी उस जमाने में.
Yeah. He built dams and he built this, right? After all,
वो पूना से पढ़ के आए थे और उन्होंने खड़कवासला डैम में कुछ एक ऊपर कैसे डैम का दरवाजा खोलना है, वो ऑटोमेटेड सिस्टम उन्होंने कुछ वहां पे लगाया था और पेटेंट किया था उस जमाने में, ऐसा.
And not to forget the lakes in Hyderabad. He was in the Nizam's administration as well, right?
Achha.
But on this point, I must add something else about the Mysore state. So much to talk about, I guess. This Nalvadi Krishnaraj Wodeyar encouraged foreign experts to come in, right? And I'll talk of only two people. There must be hundreds of others, perhaps. The two that come straight away to mind is a gentleman, both German, by the way. Okay, his name is Königsberg, right? He was an architect, right? In fact, he became the state architect in the 30s and then continued. He built a number of things in Bangalore and elsewhere, right? The aquarium, for instance, Bal Bhavan is Königsberger's design, right? I remember the IISC is again a gift of the Maharaja of Mysore, of course, with support from the Tatas, right? But Königsberger is one who was a very prominent citizen of the state, right, foreigner, and the other one, of course, is the one who who continued the great work at Lal Bagh is Krumbigal, right, the horticulturist. Much more than just the horticulturist. He was bordering on a urban planner, right, something that perhaps Bangalore is in desperate need of today, right, proper urban planning. But dono gentlemen, this is a good example of how you brought expertise from outside. Let me end on that point with one very important piece of foreign expertise. जब हिंदुस्तान एयरक्राफ्ट फैक्ट्री फॉर्म हुआ था 1940 में, वो जॉइंट वेंचर था सेठ वालचंद हीराचंद, प्राइवेट एंटरप्राइज फ्रॉम बॉम्बे, Mysore administration, Mysore state, and the colonial administration, British, one third, if I'm not mistaken, right? And they created this just before the war, the Second World War. 1943 mein, it became so important, Bangalore, Mysore, this thing. The British brought the United States Air Force, Army Air Force in, क्योंकि Bangalore का जो HAL airport था, became a refurbishment and repair facility for the Americans in the fight against the Japanese in the Pacific, right? And in fact, you had American soldiers stationed there. The HAL का जो factory था and the entire premises was taken over by the United States Army Air Force from 1943 to 1946, right? And then वो जो princely state का जो stake था, I think it was sold to the independent India, if I'm not mistaken, and then of course it becomes a public sector enterprise thereafter. After that, but I think it's clearly driven by the sentiment of education, technical knowledge, progress, and the rest.
नहीं, ये आपने बहुत बहुत बढ़िया चीजें बताई और आज का पूरा एपिसोड इतना कुछ जानने को मिला सिद्धार्थ। हम जनरली कोशिश कर रहे हैं ये आजादी की राह सीरीज में सिर्फ ये इतना लंबा पीरियड है कि हिंदुस्तान किस तरह से आजाद हुआ और उस समय को समझने के लिए अलग अलग फैसेट्स हम समझना चाहते हैं, पूरे हिंदुस्तान के अलग अलग पहलुओं के भी और अलग अलग रीजन्स के भी।
I'll just read to you, I told you right about this letter from Nalvadi Krishnaraja Wodeyar on the 25th year of his reign. And this is what he writes in all three languages, and I'll read the English one out, of course. On this day, when I complete the 25th year of my reign, I send my loving greetings to each one of my dear people with a heart full of solicitude for their happiness. With increasing effort, I shall, while life lasts, endeavor to promote their welfare and prosperity. And I pray that God may give me light and strength to achieve this, the supreme object of my life and rule. That's Krishnaraja Wodeyar talking in 1927. I think it was it's a good note to end on. Thank you so much. Dhanyawad. And I hope ये जो मेरा I think 2% का जो हिंदी था इसमें, I hope you will forgive me.
तो ये आज आपने मैसूर के प्रिंसली स्टेट के बारे में बता करके हम लोगों को एकदम तरोताजा कर दिया। बहुत मजा आया सुन के। तो धन्यवाद आपका। हमारे श्रोताओं को उम्मीद है पसंद आया होगा। आपको अगर कुछ सवाल है हमसे, आपके कुछ दिमाग में और सवाल आते हैं और आपको कुछ और लगता है कि किसी तरीके के टॉपिक हमको कवर करने चाहिए इस श्रृंखला में, तो हमको जरूर बताइए। धन्यवाद।
उम्मीद है आपको भी मजा आया। यह पॉडकास्ट संभव हो पाया है तक्षशिला इंस्टीट्यूशन के सपोर्ट के कारण। तक्षशिला पब्लिक पॉलिसी में शिक्षा और अनुसंधान के लिए स्थापित एक स्वतंत्र संस्था है। आप दुनिया के किसी भी कोने में हो, आपकी उम्र कुछ भी हो, अगर आप पब्लिक पॉलिसी, विदेश नीति या टेक्नोलॉजी गवर्नेंस में रुचि रखते हैं तो तक्षशिला की वेबसाइट takshashila.org.in पर उनके कोर्सेज को जरूर चेक कीजिए। और अगर आप पुलियाबाजी में शामिल होना चाहते हैं तो हमसे कनेक्ट कीजिए puliyabaazi@gmail.com पर या फिर @puliyabaazi ट्विटर पर। शुक्रिया।
IVM